metric test na. Kaya kasi the problem is, ako kasi nag-handle ako ng mga advices and minsan ako yung statistician. Bihira yung na-experience ko na yung nagsusulat ay maalam na siya about statistical methods. Kasi sabi ko nga, hindi lang yung statistical methods, hindi lang siya dealing with the interpretation of the data. Hindi lang yun eh. So, the process starting from the formulation of the problem up to the last yung reporting, making conclusion, it covers yung statistical method. At the simplest statistical methods like descriptive stat, minsan nagkakamali pa ng pag-identify ng tamang analysis sa nag-gather na data or with respect to a problem. Halimbawa, the first question usually is yung demographic profile. So how may the profile of the respondents be described in terms of meron tayong mga profile variables. So when it comes to data analysis, kung ano-anong dinidiscuss na analysis techniques para ma-analyze yung na data na gather with respect to the profile. So, hindi pa matumbok na descriptive stats like frequency counts and percentages to show, for example, the number of males, the number of females, the percentage of males and females, or parang mas maganda nga, di ba, yung ginawa natin yung cross-tabulation. So, yun lang sa part na yun. Hindi pa ma-identify kung ano yung tamang statistical analysis na gagawin, techniques para sagutin yung first SOP about description of profiles. I decided to start with the basic kasi ito yung mga madalas magamit. So, kung saswertein tayo, we go to more advanced techniques na medyo hindi pa ganong ginagamit. Like dito sa NUST, yung tinatawag na mediation analysis. So parang ginagamit na siya, especially in some parts of Visayas, yung mga universities doon. Pero dito kasi, parang hindi pa open sila about mediation analysis. So medyo start tayo with the basic and then we will see if makakarating tayo dun sa part na yun. So tutuloy natin yung discussion natin. Pwede na ba tayo magsimula ng ating discussion? Pwede na. So, mag-screen share ako. You do your own thing. Makinig kayo ano may ginagawa ninyo. And then I will check the attendance after. And then I will see if I can schedule the exam or the quiz or evaluation next week. Yala, nadagdagan na naman ng nadagdagan na naman tayo ng ating lesson. So, naka-screen share na ba ako? Ayan natin. Bubuksan ko yung PowerPoint. Ayan. So, naka-screen share na ba ang PowerPoint natin?
Yes,
po.
Okay. So, our lesson for today, nasa Learning Unit 4 na tayo, is hypothesis testing. So, isa ito sa mga pinaka-importanting topic when it comes to statistical methods, how to test hypothesis. So, usually, ginagamit yung hypothesis testing if we have an inferential statistics if we need to use an inferential statistics, and this is reflected in the statement of the problem. So, usually, when you ask question that needs answer na yes or no, you need to state a hypothesis or an assumption or an assumed answer, and then ipuprove natin kung tama ba yung hypothesis natin, do we retain it or do we reject it. So dapat merong ebidensya na magbaback up dun sa ating decision to accept or reject the hypothesis that we stated. So usually the questions that we are trying to answer in the SOP to perform hypothesis testing has something to do with establishing correlation, significant differences or effect. Yung mga ito. So kailangang sagutin siya yes or no. Meron bang correlated ba? Meron bang significant difference? Meron bang effect yung variable dun sa isang variable? So the answer is either yes or no. So we assume always the null hypothesis that there is no. So the answer, tentative assumption is there is no. So bakit kaya laging wala ang assumption natin? So i-discuss natin pertaining to Learning Unit 4 or hypothesis test. Our statement of the problems. So usually ang pinaka-error, the standard error that the writer committed when stating the statement of the problem is the use of the word effect. Sabi, how may the effects of the intervention techniques to the learning of the students be described? Yung effects na yun. Tapos gagamit siya ng Likert scale to determine the effects. When you say effects, this is needs some kind of inferential statistics para masagot mo. Kasi to measure effect, you need to establish, for example, that there is a correlation. And then after that, if there is a correlation, you will measure the effect size by regression analysis. So you do not just use the word effects and measure it using an instrument like a Likert scale. To measure effect, you need to perform inferential statistics. First is to establish correlation, and then after that, you measure the effect size in terms of performing another test, which is regression. So yun yung laging kinokorek doon. Kapag may SOP, basta sinabi lang may nai-state lang na problem, pero meron palang connotation yung mga words na to. So let us discuss how to perform hypothesis testing. So ito yung objectives natin for our lesson for tonight. Yan, may English translation, may Chinese translation siya para sa mga Chinese speaking dyan. O naglagay na ako ng mga subtitle na Chinese. So the objectives of the lesson for tonight are the following. So at the end of the lesson, the students are expected to differentiate null form from alternative hypothesis. So yun yung translation, chong chong king chong chang. And then formulate how to formulate the null and the alternative hypothesis for a given research problem. So yun yung translation niya. Then compare and contrast directional and non-directional tests. And then to illustrate the steps in hypothesis testing. So yan lang yung objective natin, and at the end of the lesson na attain ninyo itong objectives ng lesson natin ay marunong na kayo ng hypothesis testing at pwede nyo na siyang i-apply sa pagsusulat ninyo ng inyong research proposal. So let us start with the introduction. So basic statistic courses include lessons on summarizing and organizing and describing a set of data or a frequency distribution in terms of how do the scores typically look like. So to describe this, there is a measure that we use in order to summarize or have a general description of a set of data. So these are the measures of central tendency, like the mean, the median, and the mode. Or sometimes we describe a data set based on how much they are spread out from high to low scores. So for this, for us to do this, we use measures of variability like the range, the variance, and the standard deviation. So in the previous modules or lessons or learning unit, you learned the meaning of these concepts and how to compute for these values, not only using longhand calculations, but most importantly, how to use the SPSS. So medyo madaling gamitin, medyo madali yung naging calculation natin kasi we do not need to use long formulas and calculators. So yung mga natatakot sa mga numbers, hindi na natin kailangan gawin yan because we have the software. So the software will compute for us these measures of central tendency and measures of variability. So siguro by now, meron na lahat kayong naka-install sa mga laptops ninyo ng SPSS version, ng mababang version, yung wala pang ibang mga features ng SPSS. So anyway, it will work naman. Kaya yun kasi yung libre, yun yung may crack. So naka-pause yata yun sa group chat natin, yung wala pa diyang naka-install, install nyo na siya. May direction naman on how to install the software, pero kung hindi nyo masundan, siguro you ask the help of someone who know how to install. Napaka-helpful kasi nung ano na yon, nung tool na yon. Kahit hindi kayo mag-thesis or dissertation writing, halimbawa, sa office ninyo may pinapagawa sa inyo yung head ninyo o gumawa ka nga ng research, or tignan mo nga ito, i-simplify mo nga itong data na to, may presentation ako, how would you construct graphs, and how would you show the magnitude, for example, nung mga categories na naipon ninyo to show, for example, yung involved ka sa sales, how much is the sales for the month, for the year. So graphically, you can show that through the use of charts and graphs. So meron nun sa SPSS. And then, kung gusto mo magpakitang gilas, edi i-cross tabs mo pa, di ba? So, in terms of sales, yung different products that are being offered by the company, i-cross tabulation mo yon. So, mas magiging maganda yung presentation. So, hindi lang sa pagsusulat ng thesis or dissertation, even in your job, which requires, for example, presentation, pwede nyo din gamitin yung SPSS. So however, yung analysis natin, it goes beyond the purpose of just describing a particular data set. Kasi many problems require that we decide whether or not a statement about the mean or the standard deviation of a sample set of scores ay totoo o hindi. So in statistics, ang tawag dito sa mga statement na to ay hypothesis. And the decision making about whether this statement is true or false is what we call hypothesis testing. So, nung high school siguro tayo, naalala ko merong 5 steps in hypothesis testing. But the number of steps vary with respect to different references na ginagamit ng teacher. Pero kahit yan ay 5, 4, 3 lang, 10, it covers all the steps in hypothesis testing. Minsan nako-compress ito kaya medyo kokonti yung steps. Minsan naman spread out siya kaya medyo marami yung steps. So kahit 3 yon, 4, 5 hanggang 10, basta it covers the steps in hypothesis testing from the initial activity or initial step up to the last step. So we call that hypothesis testing. Now, a hypothesis is defined as being basically a statement about the target population. So hypotheses are formulated as a result of years of experience, of observations and researches. So however, due to many factors, the whole population cannot be studied. Bakit? Kasi di ba, sometimes the whole population involves not only thousands, but hundreds of thousands and even millions of respondents. And for us to be able to use all these respondents just to answer a particular statistical question, as mangangalap ka, gagamitin mo yung whole population, ay napakalaking gastos no, not only money in terms of money, but also in terms of time and effort. That is why we do not consider the population, but only a part of that population, which we call the sample. So the question is, can we infer using only a part of that population, which we call the sample, in order to determine whether or not a hypothesis is acceptable or not acceptable? So there are conditions, syempre, in determining the sample size, which can be a representative of the population, and we already discussed that. So due to many factors, due to these factors economically, in terms of money, time, and effort, yung whole population, it cannot be studied. So instead, we take or select a random sample from the population being studied, and from the data gathered, we decide whether the hypothesis is true or false. So napaka-importante na yung sample mo will be a representative of the population, because if the sample is not a representative of the population, then the result or the decision of whether accepting the hypothesis to be true or false will not be valid. So yun pa lang sa question na yun, yung itatanong sa inyo. How did you determine the sample size? Yung bang population mo based on the criteria that you set? Sila ba talaga yung dapat na maging participants mo for this particular study? So pag may question na about the population and the way that you select the sample from the population, if there is a question about that, then the result will not be valid. So dun pa lang make sure that at the start of the research process, you identify the right population and you adapted the right or the appropriate the appropriate sampling techniques. And also the sample size na na-determine ninyo ay siya ay acceptable in terms of statistical constraints like level of confidence and margin of error. Now, like what I've said generally sa research, if we have no designated level of confidence and margin of error, it is always assumed or understood that the level of confidence should be at 95% and the margin of error is 5%. Pag hindi nakaset, assumed na talaga yun. So yun yung first requirement for the hypothesis to be true or false, to be accepted as true or false. Then we need to make sure that the population, the target population, with respect to the criteria that we set, itama siya. And the way that we draw the sample from the population is also correct. Walang bahid ng duda. And the sample size is also correct. So kung na-satisfy na natin yung basic condition na yon, then we are ready to perform hypothesis testing. So a statistical hypothesis is an assertion or it is a conjecture concerning one or more population. So it is a preconceived idea about the values of the population parameters which can be verified through statistical tests. So yung statistical hypothesis mo, whether the decision is to accept or reject this hypothesis should be it should be verified through statistical tests. So before tayo mag-continue, I have a question. What is the difference between an opinion and a conclusion? Anybody? Opinion and a conclusion. May pagkakaiba ba yun? Anybody who would like to volunteer? Just your idea. Hindi naman kailangan tama. Pwede namang mali. Si Tomay nagre-raise ng hand. Nauna si Mr. Ladaran. Sige, Mr. Ladaran. Sabihin mo nga, ano pagkakaiba ng opinion at conclusion?
Ma'am, based lang po sa aking pagkakaintindi. Opinion, ayun, yung nagsabi.
Ano yung opinion?
And opinion is based on your personal perspective, sabi nga ni Sir kanina. But while conclusion is based on facts and data.
Are you sure?
Yun po ang pagkakaintindi ko.
Yun tama naman yun kasi opinion mo yun, di ba? Sabi ko, wala naman maling opinion, yan yung opinion mo. Pero parang may mas maganda yatang sagot. Pagandahan na lang tayo ng sagot, walang mali. Basta paganda. Si Mr. Harmon Miranda, can you tell the difference between an opinion and a conclusion?
Hello po, Doc.
Pag mo yan, sir, may premyo ka.
Hello po, Doc. Good evening po. Kagaya po ng nabanggit kanina, when we say opinion, it is belief or belief or perspective without any supporting data or supporting evidence. And on the other hand, when we say conclusion, this is already given data or given
So based on
supporting.
facts?
Yes po, Doc.
Okay. But yung opinion ba, even you make your opinion, you do not base it on facts ba, sir?
Sometimes, Doc, we have opinion based on our assumption, but most of the time when we say conclusion, it is based on the assumption naman, Doc.
Known facts.
Yes po.
Pwede. Very good. Pwede. Pero meron pang mas magandang explanation doon. Sino ba? Sino pa ba? Any volunteer?
Hi, ma'am. Hi, ma'am.
Oh, yes, Mr. De Asis.
I think possible din explanation is opinion is subjective and conclusion is objective.
Because it is based on facts, based on data.
And
sir?
yung isa is
Okay.
conclusion are objective.
Oh, tama din naman. Wala namang mali eh. So, tama. Di ba the teacher is always right? Kaya ako right ako. That's my opinion. O gusto niyo ng ano, based on my opinion, this is how an opinion and a conclusion differs from each other. Di ba during defense, nakapag-doctoral na kayo, di ba? So, na-experience nyo na mag-defend at saka ng inyong thesis at saka ng inyong dissertation, right? O tas itatanong sa inyo ng panel, Mr. De Asis, before we start, may I ask you how do an opinion differs from a conclusion? Di syempre si Mr. De Asis naman. Kung hindi ka kinakabahan, ikaw ay magpapakitang gilas para mataas yung grade na mabigay sa'yo. Sasabihin ng panel member, do you see that door, Mr. De Asis? Pointing to the door, going out of the defense room. Yes, ma'am, sabi ni Mr. De Asis. Okay, if you see that door, kung open yun, you can go out. But conclusion, you stay on this room. So that is the difference between an opinion and a conclusion. Gets nyo ba? Oy, hindi na gets. Ayoko na.
Hindi pa nagsisink in, ma'am eh. Kinabahan ako
You
doon.
know, do you see that door? Kung open yun, you can go out. Pero conclusion, you can stay on the defense room and continue your defense.
Yes po, the conclose.
Nag-gets na. Kung open
Apo,
yun, syempre you can go out. Open nga eh. But conclusion, you cannot go out of the room. You continue with your defense. Okay? So that is the difference between an opinion and a conclusion. Ganun lang. Hindi mo tayo seryoso dito. Ano tayo lang dito, nagkikwentuhan lang tayo dito. So basically, on my opinion, that is the difference between a conclusion and an opinion. Okay, so let us continue. So this conjecture may either be true or not true. So there are two forms of statistical hypothesis which we call the null and yung kabaliktaran niya which we call the alternative hypothesis. Kaya lang, yung sinasabi ng research teacher natin na if you have an inferential statistics involved as reflected in the SOP, you always state the hypothesis in the null. So bakit ba laging null hypothesis? Pwede naman yung alternative. So tingnan natin bakit. So the null hypothesis which is denoted by age 0. So 0 yun na ibig sabihin wala. So this is a statistical hypothesis that states that there is no. Yung wala. If there is a question about difference, magkaiba ba yun? Significantly different. So no difference. Or if it is asking for a relationship, is there a significant relationship? The null hypothesis would be there is no. So kapag wala, that is the null hypothesis. So there is no difference between a parameter and a specific value, or there is no difference between the two parameters. So this is the hypothesis to be tested, and it represents what the researcher doubts to be true. So ang tinetest nating hypothesis ay yung null hypothesis. So bakit ba null hypothesis? Yan natin kung nasa kabilang slides na siya. Ala pa pala. So on the other hand, the opposite of the null is what we call the alternative hypothesis. So what is the alternative hypothesis? This is denoted by HA. So A stands for the alternative. So this is a statistical hypothesis that states a specific difference. So meron to, yung kanina yung null wala. So this is a hypothesis that tells us or states a specific difference between a parameter and a specific value, or in other words, there is a difference between the two. So this is the operational statement of the theory that the researcher believes to be true and aims to prove. So yun yung pagkakaiba ng HO at saka ng HA. Example. So suppose that we are interested in the average performance of a group of students in an English test. So specifically, we are interested in deciding, so ito na yon, mag-hypothesis testing ka, whether or not the mean performance denoted by the Greek small letter mu or mu. So yung mean is denoted by this symbol, a Greek letter mu or mu of the students is, say, for example, equal to 85. So our problem here is whether to decide na whether or not the mean of the students' performance in the English test is equal to 85. So how do we perform or how do we state the hypothesis if this is the problem? So this is how we state the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis is stated as mu. Remember that the mean is symbolized by the Greek letter mu. So the null hypothesis, mu is equal to 85. So by just this simple statement, we can say that there is no difference between the mean scores of the students and 85 because they are equal. So sometimes we state the null hypothesis in terms of the mathematical statement. Or when we put that into words, this is the equivalent wordings of this mathematical statement. So the null hypothesis HO, which is mu is equal to 85, in words that can be translated as there is no difference between the mean score of the students and 85. Why? Because in the mathematical statement, they are equal. Now, the alternative hypothesis HA can be mathematically stated as mu is not equal to 85. So what does this mathematical statement means? It means that there is a difference between the mean scores of the students and 85. Why? Because the mean score is not equal to 85. So in words and in in mathematical statements and in words, we can state the null and the alternative hypothesis. So that is for the first example. Now the decision is either to retain or reject the null hypothesis. Now, if the information or the data that we gathered about the performance of the students in the test, so we are talking about the mean scores in the English test of the students, is consistent with the null hypothesis, then we conclude that the null hypothesis is true, which will lead us to retain the null hypothesis. But on the other hand, if the information or data that we gathered is inconsistent with the null hypothesis, then we would conclude that the null hypothesis is false, which will lead us to reject the null hypothesis. So it is all about retaining and rejecting the null hypothesis. Now, there are criteria, statistical criteria to retain or reject the null hypothesis. For example, if your problem is about establishing if there is a correlation between the English test performance and mathematical test performance of students, or are they correlated? Yun yung tanong mo. So the answer, the tentative explanation is there is no correlation. That is the null hypothesis. Now we perform a statistical test for us to be able to decide whether to retain the null hypothesis that there is no correlation between the two performances in two different tests in English and in mathematics, or there is a relationship. So we will use a statistical test and we will decide based on one value whether to reject or retain the null hypothesis. So itong value na to, yun yung i-discuss natin. So the different parametric tests, how to decide whether to accept or retain the null hypothesis. So meron kang isang number na pagbabasihan nung decision mo na yon. So hindi pa natin siya itatakil ngayon dun sa mga susunod pa nating lecture para malaman natin kung i-reject or i-accept yung null hypothesis. So as shown in the two hypotheses, the alternative hypothesis is a statement that contradicts or disagrees with the null hypothesis. So if the null hypothesis is rejected, meaning that the statement indicating that there is no difference between the parameter and the specified value is false, then the alternative hypothesis is the conclusion or accepted, meaning that the statement indicating that there is difference between the parameter and the specified value is true. So sinabi lang dito kung what it means to reject the null. To reject the null, meaning that we accept the alternative hypothesis. Now, if we retain the null hypothesis, then we reject the alternative hypothesis. Yun lang yung ibig sabihin nun. So para mas maintindihan natin, let us have another example. So suppose that we are interested to examine the pre-test and the post-test math performance of a sample of students. So specifically, we are interested in deciding whether or not the mean performance of the students in the pre-test and the post-test are the same. So halimbawa, yung sa mga teacher dito, halimbawa ikaw ay nagbigay ng exam. So, titingnan mo sa exam mo yung math performance ng mga estudyante mo. No, nakita mo, ang daming bumagsak doon sa math test. So, ang ginawa mo is nag-introduce ka ng intervention, like nag-tutorial ka. So, nag-conduct ka ng remedial or tutorial classes. Then, after conducting the tutorial or remedial class, nagbigay ka ulit ng isang examination. So, syempre, hindi mo na uulitin yung exam na binigay mo. Mape-perfect na nila yun dahil alam na nila, di ba? So, gagawa ka ng isang test na parallel doon sa binigay mong exam bago mo sila binigyan ng tutorial or remedial class. So, nung binigyan mo sila ng exam at kinuha mo yung score nila, gusto mong malaman kung may pagkakaiba ba yung score nila doon sa pre-test na hindi ka pa nag-tutorial at saka yung score nila sa test noong nagbigay ka na ng tutorial. So is there a significant difference between the scores of the students in mathematics in the pre-test and the post-test? Doon. So kung may pagkakaiba, tumaas yung kanilang score, ibig sabihin, you can decide na effective yung ginawa mong remedial. So pag walang pagkakaiba, there is no significant difference. So retain the null hypothesis, meaning that there is no significant difference. Ibig sabihin, hindi effective yung ginawa mo remedial at tutorial kasi wala namang statistically, wala namang pinagbago yung performance nila kahit na ikaw ay nag-conduct ng remedial or tutorial. So how do we state the null hypothesis for this particular problem? Tingnan natin dito. So the null hypothesis H0 can be stated mathematically as the mean pre-test is equal to the mean post-test. So equal daw yung pre-test at saka yung post-test. So if we translate this into a statement, then we say based on this mathematical equation or mathematical statement that there is no difference between the mean pre-test score and the mean post-test score. So based on this problem, how do we state the alternative hypothesis? So the alternative hypothesis can be stated as the mean pre-test is not equal to the mean post-test. So if they are not equal, ano ibig sabihin? There is a difference. So there is a difference between the mean pre-test score and the mean post-test score. So that is how you state the null and the alternative hypothesis. May isang example pa tayo. So suppose that we are interested to compare the mean scores of two groups of students from two different math classes. Iba naman to dun sa problem kanina. Halimbawa may dalawang klase ng math, section 1 tsaka section 2. Binigyan mo sila ng examination, parehas na exam, parehas yung tanong, yung section 1 tsaka yung section 2. Na gusto mong malaman kung may pagkakaiba yung performance ng mga estudyante sa section 1 and those who belong to section 2. So anong magiging implication nito kung meron o wala? Pag merong difference yung performance in mathematics test ng section 1 at section 2, ibig sabihin hindi sila magkamukha. Yung level of siguro intelligence nila with respect to this subject mathematics ay hindi magkamukha, magkaiba sila. So yung merong mas mataas na score, yun yung mas matalino with respect to mathematical test. Ngayon, kung lumabas naman after checking na yung scores, average scores ng section 1 tsaka ng section 2 ay no significant difference or significantly not different, the test scores of the two groups, section 1 and section 2, are equal. So, ibig sabihin, there is no difference. Ibig sabihin, magkasing talino lang yung dalawang section na ito. Yun yung ibig sabihin nun. So, let us see how we can state the null and the alternative hypothesis for this example. So, ito siya. The null hypothesis H0 is the mean score of group 1 is equal to the mean score of group 2. So kung equal silang dalawa, ano ibig sabihin? No difference. So the null hypothesis can be stated as there is no difference between the mean scores of group 1 and group 2. Now the alternative hypothesis HA can be mathematically stated as the mean scores of group 1 is not equal to the mean scores of group 2. So kung hindi equal yung scores nila, ano ibig sabihin? There is a difference. So there is a difference between the mean scores of group 1 and group 2. So siguro ngayon ay malinaw na sa inyo kung paano natin i-state yung null tsaka yung alternative hypothesis given, for example, a problem involving the use of inferential statistics or the use of hypothesis testing in deciding whether or not there is or there is no. Yun yung ating aim. Now, we have what we call directional and non-directional test of hypothesis. So dito mo makikita bakit dun sa yung kung nag-high school stat kayo o college stat kayo, meron dong two-tailed tsaka one-tailed test. So ba't kaya, tapos magkaiba sila ng value dun sa table. Kailan ginagamit yung one-tailed at saka two-tailed? Nakikita natin yan kasi nung araw, wala pa tayong SPSS. Gumagamit tayo ng table, di ba? Table for the T value, table for the Z value, table for the F value, and we decide whether or not to reject the null hypothesis based on these values. So makikita mo doon, bakit merong one-tailed tsaka bakit merong two-tailed? Kailan gagamitin yung one-tailed test at kailan gagamitin yung two-tailed test? So a test of hypothesis ay dalawa siya. It is either one-tailed. So pag one-tailed siya, tawag doon ay directional kasi meron siyang direction. So a one-tailed test is a test of hypothesis which is directional. And a two-tailed test, we call this a non-directional test of hypothesis. So kailan ginagamit yung one-tailed? Yung merong direction, either kaliwa or kanan. Tapos yung two-tailed, pwedeng kaliwa, pwedeng kanan. So wala siyang direction. So, kailan gagamitan ang one-tailed at two-tailed? So, ang one-tailed test of hypothesis occurs when the research has an a priori expectation about the sample value that he expects to observe. So, the researcher wants to test whether a mean is larger or smaller than the hypothesized population mean. So, kung meron ka na agad assumption dun sa magiging result, halimbawa, balikan natin yung test sa math. So, nagbigay ka ng math test, nakita mo yung score nila na dismaya ka kasi mababa sila lahat. So magbibigay ka ngayon ng remedial. Pag nagbigay ka ng remedial, meron ka na agad assumption na effective yung ginawa mong intervention kasi nagkaroon na ng intervention. So the assumption would be mas mataas yung makukuha na score ng mga estudyante kasi nag-conduct ka ng remedial test. So meron ka ng priori expectation. Either mataas yung makukuha nilang score or hindi naman bababa kasi ang expectation mo ay tumaas dahil nag-conduct ka ng remedial. So in this case, meron ka dong one-tailed test. Yun yung gagamitin mo kasi you already have a priori expectation about the sample value that you expect to observe. So that is the time you use a one-tailed test. Yun naman two-tailed test of hypothesis, yun yung non-directional It occurs when the alternative hypothesis does not specify a directional difference for the parameter of interest. So this is appropriate when the researcher does not have a priori expectation regarding the value that he expects to observe in the sample. So the researcher wants to see if the sample mean is different from the hypothesized population mean in either direction. So kanina, yung one-tailed may priori expectation ka since nag-conduct ka ng remedial, ang expectation mo ay mas mataas yung magiging score nila. So if you want to see whether there is a significant difference and you are expecting that the scores of the students will be higher because you conducted a remedial examination, may direction ka which is one-tailed. Sa two-tailed, you do not have expectation. Either mababa yung score, na gusto mong malaman if there is a difference, either mababa or mataas. So there is no specific direction because you do not have a priori expectation that you expect to observe in the sample. So that is a two-tailed test. Now, in terms of normal curve, the two test at the same probability level, which is 95%. Pag 95% yung probability level mo, you have 5% error. Then the two-tailed test, for the two-tailed test, you have an expectation in either two direction. So one is at the left and at the right. So you divide 5% by 2. So you have 2.5% chance here and 2.5% on the other, being higher or lower in both directions, either the right or the left. So that is a two-tailed test. That is why when we use a table, we divide the alpha, the confidence level. If it is 5%, then you divide it by 2. So magiging 2.5% for each tail, for each side, left or right. Sa one tail direction, the alpha, the significance level is at 5%. So if it is on the right direction, higher or lower in the left direction, then the significance level is at 5%. So this is a directional test and this is a non-directional test, so two-tailed test. So example, may example na naman tayo. A classroom teacher hypothesizes that using lecture method in teaching a specific lesson is the same as teaching it using demonstration method in terms of students' learning. So this means that students who were taught using the lecture method would perform similarly, say on a test, than those who were taught using demonstration method. So dito, yung teacher, sabi lang yan dito na yung dalawang teaching method, lecture, at saka yung isa is, ano ba yung isa? Demonstration, wala itong epekto dun sa students' learning, parehas lang sila. Na pag binigyan mo sila ng exam, they would perform the same even if the teacher uses two different methods. So is this a directional, or do we need a directional or non-directional test if the teacher assumes that the students who are taught using the lecture method, they would perform similarly than those who were taught using a demonstration method? So walang pagkakaiba. So the null hypothesis is H0, meaning that mathematically it can be stated that the mean scores of the students who are subjected to lecture type of teaching is equal to the mean scores of the students in the test for those students who are taught using the demonstration method, or simply the performance of the students who were taught using both methods of teaching are the same or not different. So there are three possible alternative hypotheses, HA, to this null hypothesis. So what are these three possible alternative hypothesis? So kanina sinabi natin na there is no null. So meron daw tatlong posibleng alternative hypothesis dun sa null hypothesis na yon na walang pagkakaiba. So first is that we can say that the mean scores of the lecture of those students who are subjected to lecture type of teaching is equal to the mean scores of the students who are subjected to a demonstration type of teaching. So the mean score of the students using lecture method is not equal to the mean score using demonstration method. That is the alternative. Kasi remember that the alternative is the opposite of the null. Kabaliktaran eh. Kanina sa null, there is no. So dito, sa alternative, meron silang pagkakaiba. So the first alternative hypothesis is this. Meron silang pagkakaiba, they're not the same. So that is the first form of null hypothesis. The other form is that kung sila ay magkaiba, pwedeng yung lecture yung scores ng students who are subjected to the lecture type is greater than the mean scores of the students who are subjected to demonstration type of teaching. So itong symbol na to na mas malaki o mas mataas yung score nila dito, it also tells us that the mean scores of the students in different types of teaching method is not the same, which is the null hypothesis. Ang pagkakaiba lang nila, this time, meron ng direction. Kasi yung dito, yung score in one type of teaching is greater than the other. The same is true with this next form of the null hypothesis. This time, yung mean scores ng estudyante doon sa na subject dun sa lecture type, yung score niya doon is less than the score of the students who are subjected to demonstration type. So meron ding direction dito because you assume that since they are not equal, one of the scores is either higher or lower. So in this case, lower siya, pero it is also the alternative hypothesis because remember that the null is there is no. So the mean score of the students using lecture method is lower than the mean score using demonstration method. So all these three, itong tatlo na to, although they have different meanings, these are null hypothesis because it contradicts, this is our alternative hypothesis because it contradicts the null hypothesis. Yung null kanina, there is no. So itong mga alternative hypothesis na to, there is, yung first natin, no direction, they are not equal. For the second one, they are not equal because one is greater than the other. And for the third, they are not equal because one is less than the other. So these are the three forms of alternative hypothesis, which is the opposite of the null hypothesis. So the first alternative hypothesis allows for the possibility that either, kasi sinabi lang doon not equal, so it means that either the mean of the lecture is greater than or less than the mean of the demonstration. So in this case, if this is your alternative hypothesis, then the test that you will perform is a non-directional or two-tailed test. Because either mas mababa yung isa or mas mataas yung isa, but we do not know. Ang sabi lang natin ay they are not equal. So if you perform a test and you want to answer this, you want to accept or retain the null, then you use a two-tailed test because this is non-directional. Whereas the second alternative hypothesis is specific naman yung isa. So hindi siya equal, pero doon sa second, sinabi natin na yung mean doon sa lecture is greater than the mean in the demonstration. This is an example of a directional or one-tailed test. So yung pangatlo, less than naman siya, is also a directional one-tailed test. So it illustrates what they mean by two-tailed test, which is a non-priori without expectation, and the other is a one-tailed test in which the researcher has a priori expectation or there is a direction. So that is a one-tailed test because it is a directional test. So yun ang ibig sabihin kung kailan natin i-conduct yung directional at saka non-directional test of hypothesis. So the null and alternative hypothesis are stated together as shown. So ito, i-simplify lang natin through a table. So for the null hypothesis, H0, two-tailed meaning equal, there is no difference. For one-tailed right, either less than or equal to, or for a one-tailed left, greater than or equal to. For the alternative hypothesis, if this is the null hypothesis, then the alternative would not be equal. If this is the null hypothesis for one-tailed right, so ang kabaliktaran niya, if this is less than, kabaliktaran is greater than. For one-tailed left, if the null hypothesis is greater than or equal, then the alternative hypothesis will be less than. So yan, this is the summary when stating the null and the alternative hypothesis. You just translate this na lang into words pag isinulat nyo yung mathematical expression. So let us continue. Now, example. So a teacher thinks that using a module will enhance the performance of the students in statistics. So in the past, the average grades of students was 75. So ito yung basihan mo, 75 eh. So yung teacher daw, naniniwala siya na pag gumamit siya ng module, tataas yung performance kasi ma-enhance in statistics. Ibig sabihin, the null hypothesis, so yung wala. So the mean scores of the students is less than or equal to 75. So the null hypothesis is one-tailed right. The null hypothesis is that the performance will not be enhanced kasi less than sa 75 yung score niya. So it could be the same kasi nga hindi siya na-enhance, so pwedeng hindi na bago or even lower. So we have the symbol less than or equal to. Now, the alternative hypothesis would be the mean performance of the students is greater than 75. So what does it mean? So it means that the alternative hypothesis is again one-tailed kasi may greater than eh. So because he expects that the performance will increase because the performance is greater than yung standard na pinagko-compare natin, which is 75. So the alternate hypothesis is that the performance will be enhanced as shown in the symbol greater than. So this is one-tailed test also. Now, example 2. So a psychologist thinks that a therapy will reduce the anxiety of patients suffering from insomnia. So in the past, the average levels of anxiety was 4.0. This was interpreted on a scale of 1 to 5. So what will be the null hypothesis for this particular problem? So H sub 0, the mean anxiety of patient is greater than or equal to 4.0. So the null hypothesis is one-tailed, but this time this is the left. So the null hypothesis is that the anxiety will not be reduced kasi greater than or equal to siya. So it could be the same or it could be even higher. Now, the alternative hypothesis is the opposite of the null. So the mean anxiety of patients will be less than 4.0. So the alternative hypothesis is again one-tailed. It is on the left direction because he expects that the anxiety will decrease. So the alternate hypothesis is that the anxiety will be reduced. It is interpreted using the symbol less than. So again, we have another example. So a research thinks that advertising in radio or print will change the buying preference of teenagers for a certain perfume. However, the researcher is not sure whether the sales will increase or decrease. O eto, wala kang assumption dito kasi hindi mo alam kung ano yung magiging effect ng advertising na i-adapt ng company kung mag-advertise siya sa radio. So, however, the researchers hindi siya sure whether the sales will increase or decrease after the advertisement. So, in the past, the average sales was 50,000. So, the null hypothesis would be the mean sales naman to is equal to 50,000. So, the average sales after the advertisement does not differ from 50,000. And then the alternative hypothesis will be the opposite of the null. So if mu or the mean sale is equal to 50,000 for the null, then the alternative would be the mean sale is not equal to 50,000, meaning that the average sales after the advertisement is different from 50,000. So it could be higher or lower. So since there is no particular direction because the researcher is not sure whether the sales will increase or decrease after the advertisement, then he can use a directional or a two-tailed test. Non-directional po pala. So sorry, non-directional yon or what we call a two-tailed test. So it will either increase or decrease. So yun yung pagkakaiba ng one-tailed test at saka ng two-tailed test, and the way that we will state the null and the alternative hypothesis, doon natin makikita if we need a one-tailed or a two-tailed test. So minsan ang ibibigay na exam sa iyo, there will be given a mathematical statement. So you will be asked to determine whether the test is one-tailed or two-tailed, or there is a null hypothesis, and then you will state the alternative hypothesis in different forms using one directional or non-directional test of hypothesis. No, ganun lang, practical, kasi kung magbigay ng exam, hindi ako nagbibigay ng definition. Diba? What is define the following, yung ganun. One-tailed test, two-tailed test, null hypothesis, ano ba yun? Alternative. I do not give examinations that way. I usually give situational application nung natutunan natin. So no need to memorize. Iintindihin nyo lang yung mga concept. So, merong error kasi tayo pag nagdi-decide tayo, minsan we are committing error kasi syempre tao lang tayo, di ba? Tao lang po ako, nagkakamali po ako. So, merong error when decision making with respect to the hypothesis of whether to reject or to accept this hypothesis. So, whichever hypothesis, either the null or alternative is correct, there is always a chance that the sampling error will cause the researcher to reject that hypothesis. Di ba sinabi ko sa inyo kanina na the basis of the hypothesis and the decision to reject or to retain the null hypothesis kasi the data will come from the sample. We will decide based on the data that we gathered or extracted na yung participants natin will be the sample of the population. Now, if you have committed an error regarding the determination of the sample size, nagkamali ako ng computation dun sa sample. Dapat pala ito, nagkulang ng 20. So, syempre, yung magiging result nun, ni-reject mo yung null hypothesis, yung palang pinanggalingan ng data mo ay mali kasi kulang. So, mayroong error ka na makocommit. Ibig sabihin, the result or the decision will not be valid because there is an error in determining or in sampling. Nagkaroon ka ng error. Kaya it's very important for you pagka merong inferential statistics, yung you decide or you have a hypothesis and then you decide to reject or retain the null, dapat wala kang error na makommit in terms of yung sampling, in terms of the sampling size or the criteria for determining the population kasi doon manggagaling yung sample mo. The way that you draw the sample from the population and the sample size. Kasi kapag tama yung sample size mo pero yung design mo, the way that you draw the sample from the population is not correct. May bias. Hindi ka nag-random, may bias ka, pinili mo lang yung mga kakilala mo kasi accessible sila, pinili mo yung mga kamag-anak mo. So merong bias doon sa sampling design mo. So yung decision mo to reject or accept the null hypothesis or the alternative, syempre may error din doon. So always make sure that the sampling design is not or free of error. So we may reject a null hypothesis that is true. Ni-reject mo yung null, nung pala tama pala yon. Or pwede mong i-accept yung null pero false naman pala. So meron tayong nako-commit na error because of that. These two types of mistakes in statistical hypothesis testing are called type 1 error and type 2 error. So tignan natin kung ano yung kailan ka nakapag-commit ng type 1 error at kailan ka nakapag-commit ng type 2 error. So a type 1 error is incurred if a researcher rejects a null hypothesis when in fact it is true. So, sorry po, tao lang po ako, na-reject ko yung null, pero dapat pala hindi pala siya i-reject, dapat pala siya i-accept. So, ano yung error na na-commit mo doon? Type 1 error. So, the probability of committing a type 1 error is denoted by the Greek letter alpha. And a type 2 error, ito naman ay nako-commit mo when the researcher ay na-retain niya yung null hypothesis. So there is no, when in fact, there is naman pala. So what type of error is that? So the probability of committing a type 2 error is denoted by the Greek letter beta. So alpha is for type 1 error. So it is committed when the researcher rejects a null, pero dapat pala he should have retain the null and not reject it. So that is alpha. And type 2 error is committed when the researcher retains the null, pero ang tamang decision pala is to reject the null, pero ni-retain mo. So the type of error is what we call type 2 error, which is denoted by beta. So para mas maintindihan niyo, let us have an illustration showing how a researcher or somebody commits this type of error, type 1 and type 2. So, ala pa pala. Doon pala sa bandang huli yun. So, ituloy natin. So, a correct decision is made. Siyempre, kung yung null hypothesis ay ni-retain mo, kung dapat naman talaga siyang i-retain. So, it is true and therefore should be retained. So, the probability of making this correct decision is 1 minus alpha. So, that is why the adapted level of significance in conducting a test of hypothesis is 0.05 and the probability of correctly accepting a true hypothesis is 0.95. Yun yung ibig sabihin nun. Kasi hindi naman talaga 100% sure tayo. Merong error dun eh. So merong allowance tayo in decision making. That is why we have the significance level or level of significance and the standard is 0.05. So the probability of correctly accepting a true hypothesis is only 0.95 or 95%. So that is why in educational research and sometimes in marketing and business research, ito yung acceptable na level of significance yung 0.05. Tapos, pero sa medical, something to do with medical, like for example, if you are a scientist or a medical practitioner who is developing a new treatment, tapos magko-conduct ka ng testing, tapos meron kang hypothesis, effective ba yung treatment na to, itong drug na to? In making the decision, and you state the null and the alternative hypothesis, in rejecting or accepting the null hypothesis, mas baba dapat yung significance level niya, 1%. Kasi dapat doon ang probability of correctly accepting the true hypothesis is 99%. Para siyang safeguard, ano pala yung safeguard? 99.99%. May nakaligtas pang bakterya. Pero pag medical kasi, something to do with the safety of the public and the life, the life of threat to life, dapat mataas yung probability of correctly accepting hypothesis, dapat 99%. Kaya ang level of significance is 0.01. So yun yung ibig sabihin nun. So how does it relate to the sample size? Sige nga, kung naalala ninyo yung sa sample size, paano nare-relate sa sample size yung significance level na 0.05 tsaka 0.01? Anybody who remembers our lecture in determining the sample size? Mag-open ako ng ng calculator. Ako, Diyos ko, teka nga. Ang dami ko pala ditong naka-open. Naku, makikita ninyo aking Wait lang. Teka, tignan natin kung paano natin i-relate yung committing type 1 error and type 2 error. Kasi yun daw error na yun, we committed that because of the error that we made in sampling. And it is reflected in the level of significance. So if you set your level of significance at 5%, then there is a room for error which is only 5%. Yun yung tinatawag natin na margin of error. And if you make the decision, then that is only 95% correct. So, tignan natin dito sa sampling size calculator. Dito, itignan natin for example, that here, dito sa margin of error natin, tignan. Nakikita nyo ba yung screen share ko?
Yes po.
Yes. So, for example, here that we have 1,000 population size. Kunwari 1,000 yung population size natin And then here you will find out the margin of error. If you have a population size of 1,000 and you only have 100, ikaw namili ka. Gusto ko 100 lang. Tingnan natin yung error. What will happen to the error? Ayun, ang taas ng error, 9.11%. So, increasing the sample size, halimbawa here, you increase the sample size, let us say 500 yung sample size mo. What will happen to the margin of error? So, the margin of error will be reduced to 3.04%. So, pag mali yung sample size mo, what if you get the right sample size? So at 95% and 5% and you have a population size of 1,000, what should be the appropriate ba or yung sapat na sample size? Let us see. So you have 278. You have to get 278. So yun yung tinatawag na ni-reject mo yung null based on the sample mo. Mali naman pala yung sample mo, kulang. Diba? So, dapat you have to have the right sample size in order for you to make the right decision or the acceptable decision kasi may error and you have room for error sa research, educational research at saka sa sa psychological and business research. Ang sabi nila ang margin of error is from 4% to 8% pero ang standard is 5%. Ginagamit ko lang na na katwiran yun kapag yung aking advisee na mali siya dun sa sample size. Sasabihin, ba't kulang yung sample size mo? Eto dapat. Ginagamit ko lang siya na na pangdepensa na kasi po in research the acceptable margin of error if it is an educational research is from 4% to 8%. Yun. Pero ang standard talaga is 5%. So naintindihan niyo na bakit ni-relate yung margin of error dun sa sample size? Kasi meron lang tayong margin of error na tinatawag. Pag kulang yung sample mo, hindi siya representative ng population kasi kinulang ka, tataas yung error nun. And sometimes, pag masyado siyang mataas, hindi na siya acceptable. So pag hindi na siya acceptable, di mali yung decision mo to reject or retain the null hypothesis because of the sampling that you did. And dito rin natin maipapaliwanag kung bakit, di ba sabi nila nag-aaway-aaway yung nag-develop ng vaccine, yung iba-ibang klase ng vaccine, Pfizer, Moderna, and so on. Ang pinag-aawayan nila is that yung one particular type of vaccine, mas marami siyang participants over the other type of vaccine na kukonti lang yung participants niya. Naririnig niyo ba yung ganong argument when the vaccines were developed? Something to do with the number of participants in the testing of that particular vaccine, di ba? Hindi raw representative yung sample na nakuha of the population. That is why there is a question about the efficacy of the vaccine and the safety of the vaccine as well. Kasi yung sample is not representative of the population. O di ba? So yun yung tinatawag natin when committing an error. Do you have any question about this before we continue? So wala. No, tutuloy natin siya. Teka nga, asan ba yun? Na pala, wait. So hanggang 7:30 naman tayo, 7:12 pa lang, kaya meron ba tayong ilang minutes? So, to continue, a second correct decision is made when the null hypothesis is rejected, when it is really false and therefore should be rejected. So, the probability of making this correct decision is 1 minus beta. So the level of significance is the maximum probability of committing a type 1 error. Now, researchers generally agree on using two arbitrary significance. Yung sinasabi ko, yung 0.05 and the 0.01 level. So a level of significance of 0.05 or 5% means that there is a 5% chance of rejecting a true null hypothesis. So it also means that when we repeat a sampling from a given population of interest, the probability of getting a result similar to the one that is presently observed is 95%, and the probability of getting a different result is only 5%. So in simpler speaking, yun yung 5% na to, ito yung margin mo for error. Kasi naman, hindi naman siyempre 100% tama yung decision mo because there is a limitation with respect to yung sampling na ginamit natin. Sometimes, the sample cannot really be a representative of the entire population. And minsan, when we identify the population, hindi natin makuha yung exact number niya. So, in determining the sample size, syempre, meron ding error doon. Kaya yung decision mo, based on the sample that you collected, kasi you will base your decision on that, meron siyang error. Now, the same is true for a significance level of 0.01. So the probability of getting the same result is 99%, while the probability of getting a different result is only 1%. So significance level indicates that the probability of getting the result due to plain chance is equal to or less than the alpha level. So the choice of alpha depends on the consequences associated with making a type 1 error. The smaller the value of the significance level, the smaller will be the rejection region. So it should be noted that the alpha and beta are inversely related for a peak sample size. So to reduce both error, there is a need to increase the sample size. So dapat hindi kulang yung sample size mo. Dapat sapat lang siya or pwede siyang sumobra but never less than the required sample size. So to determine the sample size, we have different calculators. Online, we have the Rao-Soft. And then yung pinakita ko sa inyo kanina. Pero the same naman yung result nilang dalawa. Either you use the sample size calculator or the Rao-Soft. Same result. Pero do not use the Sloven formula kasi until now, merong gumagamit man ng Sloven. Alam ko yung University of the Philippines nag-issue na sila ng statement regarding the use of Sloven's formula. So why do you insist on using the formula when there is an available or there are available software online that you can use for free? Na i-enter mo lang doon yung gusto mo, lalabas na yun. No need to compute. So do not insist on using the Sloven formula anymore and then discussing the formula on your manuscript. Simply say that based on Rao-Soft, this is the sample size at 5% level of confidence, margin of error, and 95% confidence interval or level of confidence. So here, the table summarizes the two types of error. So in this column, we have the decision and then we have the null hypothesis. So the decision to reject H0 or H0 is when you reject it, when in fact this is true, you're committing a type 1 error. When you reject the null hypothesis and it is false, then that is the correct decision. Now, when you accept the null hypothesis and that is true, then you are committing a correct decision. But when you accept the null hypothesis when in fact it is false, dapat hindi mo siya i-accept, dapat i-reject mo, i-accept mo, false, then you are committing type 2 error. So para maintindihan niyo, bigyan natin ng sitwasyon. So sa totoong buhay, we have illustration 1. So using court law decisions to illustrate it further, so type 1 error is incurred when an innocent person is convicted guilty of a crime that he actually did not commit. Now, on the other hand, type 2 error is incurred when a guilty person is declared innocent for a crime that he actually committed. So a correct decision is made when a person who actually did not commit the crime is declared innocent, or when a person who actually committed the crime is declared guilty. O yun lang yung ibig sabihin ng type 1 tsaka ng type 2 error in actual decision making, which is in the court or court law. So let us have another illustration. Now another illustration is on the smoke detector. So alam natin yung smoke detector na sineset up ito dun sa mga buildings. So if there is no fire, the smoke detector is either in alarm state or no alarm state. Kasi walang fire. Smoke nga yung madidetect niya. Saan ba galing yung smoke? Di sa fire. Sabi nga nila sa showbiz daw, kapag may usok, may apoy. May pinanggalingan. So, hiwalay na ba si Manny Pacquiao tsaka si Jinky? Kasi si Jinky, ay naku. Pag may usok, ay may apoy. Yun ang sabi nila. Talaga to si Christopher minamalat na nga, napaka-chismosa pa. Yun sabi niya, kung may usok, may apoy. So, eto yun. So, another illustration is on the smoke detectors that are set up on buildings. So, if there is no fire, the smoke detector is either in alarm state or no alarm state. So, alternatively, if there is a fire, the smoke detector is either in alarm state or no alarm state. That is, kasi faulty yung batteries niya. Now, if the smoke detector alarms, kapag wala namang fire, then type 1 error is incurred. But if the smoke detector does not alarm when there is fire, then type 2 error is incurred. So the smoke detector is efficient, meaning that it works well if it alarms when there is fire, or if it does not alarm when, of course, there is no fire. So, yun yung illustration nung pagko-commit ng type 1 tsaka ng type 2 error. So, it's maaga pa pala. Ituloy na natin kasi konti na lang. Ay, hindi pa pala, hanggang 57. So sa susunod na natin, i-discuss yung steps in hypothesis testing, and then after that, we will go to inferential statistics. So doon gagamitin na naman natin yung inyong skills sa paggamit ng SPSS. At dito, ano na natin, yung decision natin in rejecting and retaining the null hypothesis based on the result of the inferential statistics. So any question? May tanong?
Wala po, Doc.
Sigurado kayo, wala. So ayan yung yan yung ating lesson for tonight. May natutunan ba kayo?
Yes po,
Meron
meron.
po, Doc.
Sigurado kayo, ha? Opinion lang at conclusion, di mo alam.
Yes.
O wala. So let us check your your attendance. Teka, screen share ulit natin yung class record natin, ha, at baka screen share. O eto, share. O yan, nakikita nyo ba yung ating record for tonight? So say A if you're absent. Teka, ba't nga ba? Ayun ang maling decision. You say A when in fact you're not there. So somebody will say A for that someone who is not present. Ano? So here, Mr. Abad, A or B? Absent ba si Mr. Abad or present? Wala. So absent. Si Ma'am present siya?
Yan po siya.
Okay.
Andyan po.
Okay. Ayun ang decision ko. When absent pala, P pala. So, anong type of error yun? Si Barcelo, Jal, Rivera, Jal.
Present, ma'am.
Present. Si Nessa, Ma'am Nessa Limalanta, brilliant. Present. Eileen Kapati, Miss Eileen.
Present daw.
Si Mr. Mr. and Mrs. Mas matalino si Mr. Kasi napili niya si Mrs.
Present po, Doc.
Nabil.
Present po.
Present. Agree
Present,
or
ma'am.
disagree? Nagot ka mamaya, hindi ka makakatabi.
Agree,
Si
ma'am.
Ma'am Jessica, sabi ko na nga ba't
Present
ako
po.
matulog sa labas. So present si Ma'am Jacqueline.
Present po, ma'am.
Present si Mr. John. John, are you there? Wala. So, not there. Si Ma'am Eileen,
Ma'am, present po.
present. Si Mr. Rodolfo.
Present
Mr.
po, ma'am.
Rodolfo, present. Si Ma'am Mila.
Present po.
Si Ma'am
Present po.
Deberisa.
Present po.
Present. Si Mr. Ronel.
Present, ma'am.
Present. Si Ma'am Merlin.
Present
Ma'am
po.
Merlin, present. Si Mr. John Lee.
Present po, ma'am.
Si Mr. Mark Christian.
Present po.
Present. Si Mr. Aljon.
Present po.
Present. Si Mr. Harmon.
Present po, Doc.
Si Mr. Aldrin Munoz.
Present po, ma'am. Present po.
Si Mr. John Paulo.
Good evening po, ma'am. Present po.
Present. Si Mr. KJ. So absent si KJ. Si Mr. Hernan.
Hello
po, ma'am.
Present po.
Present. Si Mr. Jaisel Kitanek. Jaisel. Absent.
Present po, ma'am.
Ma'am pala to,
Present
ma'am.
po, ma'am.
Okay. Si Ma'am Mariel.
Thank you po.
Si Ma'am Mariel present.
Present po.
Si Miss Madeline Rigger.
Present, ma'am.
Present. Si Mr. Roston.
Present,
Present. Si Ma'am Shirley.
Ma'am, present po.
Present. Si Sir Dean Alec.
Present po. Good evening.
Akala ko naka-join yung Dean ng CMBT kasi yung pangalan CMBT Dean. Kaya ako nag-join si Ma'am Malu dito. Ikaw pala yan. Tinatakot naman ako. Si Dean Alec. Present. Si Ma'am Erica.
Present po, Doc.
Present. Si Mr. Reynaldo de Asis.
Present, ma'am. Present.
Present. Si Mr. Rico Laksa.
Present po. Present.
Present. Si Mr. Kennedy.
Present po, ma'am.
Present. Si Mr. Ladaran. Present. Si Miss Marilyn. Ma'am Marilyn.
Present po.
Present. Si Ma'am Suzette.
Present.
Present. Si Mr. Albertine.
Present, Doc.
Present. Hoy, sumali kayo sa 50th ng College of Engineering Isasama ko kayo sa group chat. Magdo-donate kayo, joke. Hindi. Baka mag-leave agad kayo. Si Mr. Jerome,
Present, ma'am.
present.
Ma'am Lori,
Yes?
wala po si Ma'am Suset.
Ay, wala ba si Ma'am Suset? O, ayan, titignan niyong mabuti ha. Si Mr. Paul dyan.
Present po.
Minsan, ang labanan na lang natin dito, attendance Mr. Paul dyan, present. Wala na. So, that's all for tonight. And huwag muna tayo mag-exam. Medyo dagdagan natin. We'll see each other next week. So, no assignment for tonight. See you next week. See you next Monday.
Thank you po,
Okay,
ma'am.
bye everyone.
Thank you po,
po, ma'am.
Thank you po.
Dok.
Bye.
Thank you po.
Thank
O,
you,
ayan,
ma'am.
Maglilib na ako